Well, what happens is God launches in verse 3 of chapter 11. Go back from Daniel to Revelation 11. And what we see, starting in verse 3, is another one of these gospel beacons, these witnesses the Lord puts forth. And it says, I will give power to my 2 witnesses. Now, wait a minute. Stop. See the slide? The 2 witnesses of Revelation 11, 3 to 14. You know what most people do? They're trying to figure out who they are. They're trying to identify them. And that's important and fun and interesting. But before you go into the identity of the 2, they are 2 what? Witnesses. Remember what Jesus said? You shall receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you in Acts 1:8, and you shall be my what? Witnesses. These are more of those gospel-giving servants of the Lord. Now remember, we studied 2 days ago, the church from Acts 1 through Revelation 5 is responsible for evangelizing the world. When the church is taken out, the 144,000 evangelists come. We saw that in chapter 7. And also we're going to see them again next time in chapter 14. But while those 2, that group, the 144,000 are doing their evangelism, God sends yet another, the 2 witnesses. And when those 2 witnesses are gone, and we're going to see that they'll be killed, the gospel angel comes. And then the next vehicle the Lord uses is going to be after the Lord starts over again in the millennium. He's going to have the gospel center, we're going to see. So they're always gospel witnesses. So those 2 witnesses are very important. Look what it says about them. I will give power to the 2 witnesses, verse 3 of Revelation 11, who will prophesy 1,260 days. How long is that? Well, that's the mathematics of the tribulation. Now remember, it's called 1 week in Daniel 9. And 1 week, actually the word is not week, it's heptad, group of 7, translates into why we say the 7-year tribulation. So you've probably heard of the 7-year tribulation, or you've heard of the fact that it's 3.5 years, which it says in Revelation, and 3.5 years, or it's called 42 months and 42 months, and it's called 1,260 days and 1,260 days. These 3 are all the same thing. What it's talking about is the tribulation lasts for two measures of time. The 7 years is 3.5 and 3.5 years. What marks this, the midpoint? Well, look what it says. And they will be clothed in sackcloth. These are the 2 olive trees. And if anyone wants to hear, verse 5, fire, or if anyone wants to harm them, fire proceeds from their mouth and devours their enemies. What God does is, from this time that the Antichrist cuts off the sacrifice in the temple. So Daniel 9, that we already read, says that they're going to have a temple that's functioning and they're going to have sacrifices. He makes a covenant for 7 years. That's where we get the 7-year tribulation. But at the midpoint, he, the worst man that ever lived, cuts it off, and God allows these 2 witnesses here to witness for 1,260 days. So that's what we're reading about here. Basically, these 2 witnesses are ministering through some of the most horrific time, and if anyone wants to harm them, fire proceeds out of their mouth. Verse 6, they have power to shut heaven so that no rain falls. And when they finish their testimony, verse 7, the beast, there's another name for him. Let me write it down. He's called the Antichrist. He's called the prince that will come. He's called the beast. Okay? Remember I told you 33 different names for him are in the Old and New Testament. But the beast that ascends from the bottomless pit, we saw the pit yesterday, remember the abyss where all those horrific creatures are, overcame them and killed them, and their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt. And those from the peoples and tribes and tongues and nations, this is where we get global communications. The whole world's going to watch this. And verse 10, everyone who dwells on the earth will rejoice. And then verse 11, after 3.5 days, there's another 3.5. Just like there's 3.5 years, there's 3.5 days. All of these are units God uses over and over again. Verse 12, a loud voice from heaven says, come up here. That's the same thing we hear in chapter 4, which is the rapture of the church. Come up here. When John says, come up here, it's the church being called out of the world, and John gets to come up and see them assembled around the throne. These two are raised from the dead and translated up to heaven. Wow. And the same hour, verse 13, there's a great earthquake, and verse 14 says it's the second woe. What was the first woe? When those monsters came out of the pit. Now look at the slide in front of you. The temple measured is the outer court to the Gentiles. In other words, the temple is up on what we would call the Temple Mount platform in Jerusalem. And right now, right in the center of it is the Dome of the Rock. Most likely, off to the side of it is going to be this Millennial Temple, and it's going to be divided. That's what the Antichrist most likely will do. He leaves for all of the 1,200,000 Islamic people the Dome of the Rock, and for the world, the rest of the world, this Tribulation Temple right here, which shows what a genius this guy is, that he can get them to be side by side. But it says, don't measure out there because it's trampled, it's unholy. But this is this temple. The two witnesses are empowered for 1,000, look what it says in this passage, 1,260 days. Now notice 4 things that the witnesses do. They can call down fire from heaven, they shut heaven with no rain, they turn water to blood, and smite the earth with plagues. First 2 are what Elijah did. Second 2 are what Moses did. That's why many people think the 2 witnesses are Moses and Elijah. Remember Moses, the Lord killed him or made him die on top of Mount Pisgah and buried him, and no one ever saw his body. And you remember Elijah was translated to heaven. Others believe that it's not right someone dies twice. Moses already died, he can't die again, because Hebrews 9 says it's appointed unto man once to die. Who's the other one that didn't ever die besides Elijah? Yeah, Enoch. So who are the 2 witnesses? Maybe Moses and Elijah, maybe Enoch and Elijah. The Bible doesn't tell us, so that means it's not something we speculate about. But look at the third thing, the beast from the abuso, that's the abyss that we talked about yesterday, kills them, and earth dwellers celebrate, and they're resurrected after 3.5 days.